Welcome to Daily Devotions. You're going to be watching this on Wednesday, and we want to talk about the Syrophoenician woman again in Mark. And something that I mentioned on Sunday that I found fascinating was there's a fine line or a fine um, division between faith and desperation. And that was something that a professor from seminary had said this last week on a commentary about the text. But I just found that really interesting that there's a fine line between faith and desperation. And it just made me start to think about how so often when things are going fine and good in life, we're fine and good, and God's fine and good, and everything just is kind of, God is sort of equal with everything else in our life, maybe. When we're desperate, then God becomes primary, or we turn our faith practices to God and we pray more and we reach out more. And just to think about that dynamic a little bit. And I don't know that it's even necessarily a bad one when even just, but it's something to ponder, to think about where our faith is in the normal times, where our faith is in times of blessing, and where our faith is in times of challenge and hardship. And just to pay attention to that and know that God's relationship with us is unchangeable, that God's always present, that God's always giving us all of God's love, that God's always journeying beside us, and just to acknowledge that. So let's listen to the story. This is Mark chapter 7, verse 24. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and didn't want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice, but a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demons left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. I love that story, just one for the fact that I talked about at the beginning, faith and desperation, but that she refused to let go of God's blessing. She refused to let go um, of her value and her worth, that certainly she can have something. And even the littlest bit of what God can offer is more than enough. And that's something that I think about. Even the littlest bit of what God offers is more than enough. And how we live in the present moment with that knowledge and embrace it. Because often that's just not how I am. We're always kind of looking out, and it's a challenge to stay anchored in the value that God lays over the top of us, and the value that God lays over the top of everyone else. And this woman, even though she shouldn't know, it knows, and she refuses to let go of God's blessing. Yesterday, or on Sunday, I mean, when we talked about this text in Bible study afterwards, we had a really interesting discussion more about Israel. And it means the name Israel means to wrestle with God, or um, to struggle with God, and how that's just part of faith. And we see this literally here, this woman struggling with God and drawing God's blessings out. Now that's dangerous, because if we don't, or we, it might be dangerous to think if I just struggle hard enough, God will bless me and heal so and so, or do this and do that. I just think it's more intended to show us that our relationship with God's real, that God's listening and paying attention, and that God's with us in the person of Jesus Christ, engaging the world in life, and that here we are, that in any present moment, there's some sort of wrestling with God that might be going on for our relationship to grow, and to realize that God's present with us. Anyway, I'd invite you to think about that. how you're wrestling with God, how you're struggling with God, how you're able to cling to your value and worth that God puts over the top of you through Jesus and his proclamation of God's love, or not. And when it's not, and we're feeling guilty or less than, or that we're not worthy, you can remember this story and remember this woman claiming everything that God says she should be valued and worthy of, even whatever, and know that you are too, far more than crumbs, because at the end of the day, Jesus doesn't just give her crumbs or give you crumbs. He gives his whole life so that we would know that God's with us. May you live in that promise today. Have a blessed day.